election coverage more generally in the 21st century is terrible. Why is this news, Josh? Well, let me tell you. I'm going to tell you exactly how it's terrible and why it's terrible, which is slightly different than normal because, of course, we've had Nigel Farage in the UK, and he's not exactly a favourite of the establishment. Normally, we have very establishment candidates, and therefore the coverage isn't as egregious as it normally is, and it has been very bad, to say the least. And yes, the first thing is this. Nigel Farage to boycott BBC over biased question time audience. And I watched this question time. I don't know whether you guys did.
I did. I also covered I did a compilation of all the questions that were asked in order and played some of them on Monday's segment.
I did see that, yeah.
Appalling.
I actually hate politics.
All right, well, thanks for coming in, Harry.
It's interested in you, however.
I know, sadly, yes.
But yes, to Connor at least...
I am our Westminster addict, yes.
Mm-hmm. This was pretty egregious. I remember watching the Green Party guy, and he had all of the charisma of a wet towel, and they were giving him softball questions. Like the most controversial one was, I like your sentiment, but how are you going to pay for this? And that was the most cutting question to the Green Party, party of Islamists, eco-zealots, and socialism. And they're like, well...
On that, Fiona Bruce did bring up that 20 candidates had been highlighted by the Times for quote-unquote anti-Semitic comments, one of them saying we should sink any Royal Navy vessels that seeks to be in Israeli waters if they seek to aid them. Curiously, no pressure on them to deselect said candidates, and much more polite about those particular remarks than when she interjected and read off with a very emotional register saying, I can't believe I'm having to say this, almost breaking down in tears. Various edgy jokes put forward by Reform candidates and deselected.
The notion of sinking Royal Navy vessels with, staffed by potentially hundreds of our lads.
Oh,
that's fine. Yeah, it is treasonous. And of course, they're treated with kid gloves. The media didn't pick up on any of that, really, did they? You didn't see Green Party candidates, their faces and names and headlines in the BBC. There was none of that. And of course, this isn't necessarily a surprise. Of course, the right gets unfair treatment. That is the political climate that we exist in now. But it was on display for everyone. And I think it being juxtaposed in one programme where you have the Green Party, the far left of British politics, against Reform, which are the centre-right, basically. And the centre-right party, technically the less extreme one in sort of objective political theory terms, is the one that gets given a hard time. And the questions sounded like they were asked by a bunch of Labour activists. And in fact, Farage does explain that he recognised some of the people in the audience, which we'll go on to talk about later. But this has been going on for a very long time with Farage. So we know that it's not just a mistake, because even, 9 years ago, he was on the BBC and there was a very left-wing audience. It's been a known thing to happen. And it does influence elections. It is important because if you stack the panel against a candidate in the way that it seems like the BBC did, then it makes it seem like the public consensus is against them, which for a lot of people who don't necessarily follow politics that closely is actually quite important in determining how they vote.
Well, this is something media companies do all the time. I can say back from my days in university, oftentimes, and this isn't necessarily question time because I went to Media City, but they filmed lots of like on-stage production shows there, like Jeremy Kyle, for instance. Most of the time, the audience wouldn't be sold out. You'd have quite a few seats filled. So they would just come over to the university and say, hey, does anybody want to come on later so that we've got a full crowd in the audience? So while this isn't necessarily always going to be specifically selecting for left-wing specifically, but university students are going to be massively over-indexing on being left-wing compared to normal people that you would get out on the street. So if the BBC is actively selecting people who are going to be left-wing or already industry insiders, I wouldn't be shocked. I wouldn't also be shocked if they just go to local media institutions and universities and say, we need some seats filled up. Can you get some people in? And they know the kind of people who are going to come around with that anyway.
So I do actually know how they select people for question time, because I've applied to be in the audience before and I got a ring and I just couldn't do it when I was asked. This was about 2 years ago. But you put the application in when it's in your local area. They then call you. They then ask you your particular background and your availability. And they essentially screen you for your opinions. And then you write down a prospective question. They ask you about all your questions, because I've also had friends that have gone on and been in the audience. And then the directors will choose ahead of time who to have their questions asked. So when Fiona Bruce points at the crowd and goes, this person, she's already been told sort of what order and who to select. So the people that were in this audience, being Palestinian activists who were supposedly running for a Never Stop Gaza party, but then didn't run and seemingly pocketed $2,000, questions to be asked there, or a BBC director who bragged about asking the first question, saying, Nigel Farage, why are you a racist and why is your party full of racists and aren't you a mean racist bad man? Yeah, the BBC...
Racist.
Yeah, deliberately set that up to happen. Definitely.
If I got that question, I would just start flexing. And I would say, oh, so you noticed.
Like Plato. Your argument is invalid.
But Farage explained this BBC boycott, and if you can humour a little clip, if I can find where the mouse has gone...
I think it's off. I can click it
Cheers,
for you
Connor.
while you turn the mouse on.
How does this technology work?
Right from the start of this campaign, the BBC have behaved like a political actor. I remember the first interview I did on the Today programme, and I came off there and thought, there's no point. There's literally no point. No opportunity to talk about policy, about ideas. But what happened on Friday with that question time audience was truly astonishing. First question gets asked by a chap who has himself produced 8 programmes for the BBC, including the very woke now Doctor Who.
Right.
So he gets to ask a question.
That was terrible.
Then the third question is asked by a chap who's a well-known street Palestinian campaigning activist. I think question number 7 or 8 was asked by a girl who's a very active left-wing campaigner, which is perhaps fine. Point I'm making is a question time audience is supposed to be representative of the country as we go into the final week of...
You get the general idea of what he's trying to say there, don't you? That he felt like the questions asked were unfairly targeting him, and all that needed to be done really was a couple of people who are pro-reform, or at least not actively hostile to him, saying, so what is your plan on immigration? What effect do you think cutting taxes will have? Or something like that, asking them about their actual policies and not just saying you're a racist and you're responsible for Brexit. And it's basically just wagging their finger. Also, that was a weird framing where they're saying you're responsible for Brexit, even though it was the Conservative Party that carried it out.
Yeah, one guy asked, so what tax cuts do you benefit from since coming out of the EU? And Farage was like, none. Taxes are the highest since 1948 and I'm not Prime Minister. What are you talking about?
They're having a go at him like he's already in power, which is a bizarre way for the BBC to pick questions, really, isn't it? But of course, the media picked up on this because they're not ones to miss out on a potential smear. So here we have the National. Nigel Farage refuses to appear on BBC after question time humiliation.
Well, question time's reputation was humiliated, but not particularly Farage.
Yeah, and I quite liked this from the Telegraph, actually. Green shoots and Farage struggles to score as BBC Bias takes a trophy, and she referred to the Green Party guy as a living tofu sculpture, Adrian Ramsey, which I thought was funny. She mentions he had a gentle ride from the audience, but Reform leader obviously didn't. Went down curiously badly, which is interesting, isn't it? Sort of suggesting, well, actually, maybe there was some tomfoolery, and this was more or less published the day after, wasn't it? The actual thing went on. So it was even before Farage had come out and said, listen, they've stitched me up. So people who follow politics are able to spot this. It's not just me sort of plucking it out of thin air. And it's been something that's been going on this entire election, in fact. If you look at the BBC's page where they have their corrections and clarifications, they have everything, all BBC services, all the mistakes they make. And it's interesting, like the 21st of June, I'm not even sure if it's, there we go. This is about Reform. They were using out-of-date survey data to basically check the claims of Reform. This was data before Farage announced his candidacy, and therefore, obviously, that had a momentous shift in the popularity of Reform. And then you have down at the 9th of June, I'm going to have to find it somewhere. Some of them are a bit out of order, but most of them are to do with Reform and Farage.
Well,
Here's something about Nigel Farage again.
BBC complaints. So how the current system in the UK works is because everything's regulated by Ofcom. You have to make an Ofcom complaint if there's bias against the programme. But for some reason, BBC, being the state broadcaster, gets a special carve-out where you have to put in 2 BBC complaints, one as a viewer, one extra one if you're unhappy with the BBC's response to your complaint, and then a third one to Ofcom. So it sort of tries to disadvantage people actually complaining about bias on the BBC. And so people were complaining that Laura Kuenssberg's show with Farage, after the D-Day kerfuffle with Rishi Sunak, where she kept pressing him, saying, but when you say Rishi Sunak doesn't get our culture, what do you mean, Nigel? Obviously trying to bait him into saying, because he's brown, rather than because he's a managerial technocrat who feels more at home in an airport than in Parliament. So people complaining about bias on there. I actually complained about the bias of the Question Time thing, and immediately the stock answer I got back was, Question Time takes a representative sample of the audience. Well, then why weren't there 20% Reform supporters in the audience? Because that's how they're currently polling.
Well, yeah, that's exactly it, isn't it? And then you go back to the 28th of May. So this is all of the BBC services. And there we go, Nigel Farage again. This was a presenter, and this is their direct words. Our presenter said Mr. Farage was using customary inflammatory language. This did not meet the BBC's editorial standards for impartiality.
Well, this is Guru Murphy's sister. So you know Guru Murphy, the one who's on Channel 4 all the time?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, this is his sister, the one who mistakenly put her middle finger up when she thought the camera wasn't rolling. Cut away from one of Farage's speeches, like sort of CNN cutting away from Trump, saying we're not going to dignify his speak about biased mainstream media. And she thought that was completely fine, because that's the climate of the BBC newsroom. So much for impartiality. They're not impartial. They're just cloaking their bias in the veneer of being objective.
And then we even go back to the 16th of March, and they have a retraction where they say we wrongly referred to Reform UK as far right.
This was
when referring to polling.
Apology, wasn't it?
Yeah, but the point being that the BBC covers a lot of stuff. It's a very big organisation, and the fact that lots of these complaints are all to do with Reform and Nigel Farage doesn't necessarily suggest that, you know, people who support Reform are just more likely to complain, because there are lots of people that complain about lots of things and sort of impropriety and that sort of thing. That still goes on. But the fact that there's a significant portion, disproportionate portion of their coverage is complaining about unfairly positioning Reform as being this thing that you should be concerned about is biasing the way that people may vote. And it's not correct for a supposedly impartial institution. Now, I don't agree that you can have impartiality, because that's impossible. You know, everyone has biases because everyone has wants and needs, because they're a human being. And the sooner we acknowledge that, the better, really.
My favourite thing about complaints about the BBC being a partial, politically biased actor is that on the left you see similar complaints where they say that the BBC is somehow a far-right organisation because when it was around the 2019 elections, they weren't being favourable towards Jeremy Corbyn. And of course, the BBC, I believe, spearheaded a lot of the investigations and exposés of Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitism. The thing that they seem to forget is not that by virtue of being against someone like Jeremy Corbyn, that makes them far right. No, it makes them regime creatures. That's what they are. They're not for the far left. They're not for the far right, if you want to consider Nigel Farage as that. They're for the status quo bureaucracy as it exists right now. And if they perceive either of those sides as being a threat, they'll lash out at them. So I just find it funny that the left always manages to turn this thing around into, oh no, the world, despite the fact that we get 99% of everything that we want in our social programs and culturally revolutionary agenda, because we don't get that tiny little 1%, the entire world is far-right fascists rising against us.
You mean to say, Harry, that the state media favours the state? Oh, my goodness.
What a shock, right? What a shock.
So they've also done things like this. Rivals attack Farage for saying the West provoked Ukraine war. This is things that, you know, as the WikiLeaks leaks suggested that US diplomats were talking about in 2008. You know, in behind closed doors, lots of people have been saying that actually, yes, we did play a role in provoking it. Obviously, you know, he wasn't letting Putin off the hook either. He was saying, I don't agree with him. I think he's a terrible man, blah, 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 blah. But the BBC's turned it into something that is somehow extreme and terrible when actually it's quite common to say these things.
I will also say that this, alongside the immigration talk that Farage specifically has been talking about, and we'll get onto some of my complaints with how the Reform campaign has been going over the past 2 weeks in your segment, Connor. But alongside his talk of immigration, this was my other favourite thing that Farage has come out and said, because he seems to be, as far as I can tell, outside of the AfD, the only British or European politician that I can think of, name more in the comments if you can think of more.
George Galloway?
Who wants to... He doesn't represent us, though.
Us?
Does he?
No.
Who doesn't want to send me off to war to die in a ditch in Ukraine.
Quite.
Now, Richard Tice,
Yes.
He's quite like, maybe you could die a little bit in Ukraine. Nigel Farage seems to be the only one who's actually come out and said, maybe we should de-escalate this. So that won immense points from me.
No, I definitely agree with that. So a Reform candidate has pointed out the same thing as me, so it's not just me noticing it. Also, people in Reform have been like, the BBC's coverage in particular has been egregious. I'm sort of running over time, so I'm going to skip over that. Another thing, even the right of the Tory party, of all things, and I'm sure Connor will be able to tell us a bit more about this, have been dragged through the mud by the BBC. So this is Miriam Cates, who was a trustee of a church up until 2018, and then they've run a story that church is now offering conversion therapy, but she funded it in 2018 and it's doing something now. That's a little bit of a stretch, to be honest.
Also, it's just conversion therapy. It's not Mike Pence strapping electrodes to your brain. It's having conversations with people that might be confused about their gender or sexuality, which should be allowed, despite if you dispute its efficacy. And also, Miriam has absolutely nothing to do with that. The reason why they're trying to trot this out is because she was one of the very, very few decent conservative politicians who stood against her own party and said, we're not doing conversion therapy pan, you absolute nutcases who are in hock to Mermaids and Stonewall under Boris Johnson's wife, Carrie. And so because she's been very effective, because she's flirted with our side of the aisle, and she's a friend of the show, they really don't like her and would like to see her deposed from her seat.
Yeah, and I'm not even convinced that conversion therapy really does anything. I don't think you can stop being gay or the inverse, I think it's pre-programmed. So it's sort of a bizarre thing.
Who cares? It's not like this church is going out and press ganging, hog tying gay people
willingly
enjoy that.
Exactly. Into it and just showing them pictures of Penny Mordaunt in a bikini, which for me would actually reinforce the homosexuality. I don't get the appeal at all. But it's not like they're doing some kind of Clockwork Orange therapy.
You mean you willingly went to an organisation for
and
a service?
spoke to them?
My goodness. This is dangerous.
That whole moral panic about it is completely blown out of proportion and completely ridiculous.
But she's tweeted about it. She's just saying, I wasn't involved with this. Anyway, back to knocking on doors. So she didn't seem to take it too seriously, which is, probably the way to deal with it. But one final thing that is not the BBC, but I thought was amusing, was this from The Guardian, always sane as ever. Mansplaining UK election coverage marginalises women's concerns, study finds.
I tried woman understanding.
Yeah. And on the topic of mansplaining the UK election, I thought it'd be good to mention our election coverage because we're going to have a lot of blokes talking about election things. There might even be a woman. I don't want to confirm anything, though. But yes, there is no balance. So yes, Carl did a video, you might have seen it on YouTube, announcing it. There's some details in there and it's free to watch, so if you are come to our website or you go to our Rumble channel, you'll be able to watch the election stream in its entirety starting from 7 p.m. British summer time, and there'll also be Rumble rants, which were basically the equivalent of super chats if you're not familiar with them, which we'll be reading out. And there's also this. So we will have Dan with a green screen.
Leaning into his Jeremy Clarkson persona.
Yes, here he is.
Well, Carl, thank you for the...
And he'll have charts.
Level, but as you can see,
I might actually mute him. Sorry, Dan. It's nothing personal.
If only you came with that function in real life.
But here you can see we have the best numbers. We've got some of the biggest
There's so
numbers.
much meme potential for this. Please.
Yeah,
I think we should just release the unedited green screen footage of him pointing at a green screen, and you can all have some fun with that.
But Samson's foreshadowing there. But we have graphics. We are moving up in the world. We have discovered the world of technology, and see, we've even got a thermometer, a zero-seat thermometer to count how few seats the Conservatives will have. So obviously it's going to be very good. It's also worth mentioning as well, gold tier website subscribers get to submit video comments. And remember the FAQ for these video comments, it tells you what format you need to keep them to, no longer than 30 seconds. And I think my advice to, the best chance you have of playing, because we do editorialize them, is that either questions for people specifically on the panel is very helpful, or statements about what you think will happen, things to do with the election, generally speaking, or the people that are on covering it will be a good way of getting your comment heard. So that is the way to go. And also, if that's not enough, we also have the ability to sign up or upgrade to Gold Tier to receive 50% off for the first 3 months with the promo code 0seats. All capital letters, no space. So if you do want to submit comments, if you want to be a part of our election coverage at this historic moment, you can.
Carl looks really blazed in that image there. I'm sorry, I had to point it out. He's been spending some time with Dank, presumably.
But no, Carl's actually very excited about it.
Oh, yeah.
And it's also worth mentioning as well, if you aren't able to tune in, there is an election party in London. Here are the details. Somewhere in London, the Water Rats. It's only £5, and they'll be playing us in the bar, our live stream. So if you want to go to a bar and watch Lotus Eaters and drink your sorrows away at Labour winning, you can do that. I think it's 8 p.m. till 1 a.m. and that's Maven, I think, sorting that out, friend of the show. So
good lad, shorter than you'd expect.
You're so mean.
Bogging our friend.
I love Maven. He's a great guy, but he is quite short.
Also, I wanted to have a special thank you to Luna for sending us all of this stuff.
You've made her year.
Oh, yeah.
She's made mine. Look at all of this wonderful stuff. So thank you to everyone who has sent us gifts to consume during the stream. For us and our guests, this is going to be great. I think the coffee and tea as well is going to keep us alive. So that is very kind of you. And, you're all sweethearts. I know it. You might talk tough sometimes in the comments, but I know you've got soft hearts. That's going to wind some people up, I imagine. Mm-hmm. But also, we want to see your election party pictures as well. So if you can send them to our social media account, I believe our social media manager will be here. And, we might be able to feature them in our stream if you're having a particularly good time with our stream featuring. So we want to see it. We want to make it an occasion. We want to make it a good time. Most people are probably working the next day, so they're not going to be able to do that. But if you can, enjoy it. But anyway, obviously our coverage is better than the BBC's. Our coverage is the best. And make sure to watch it.
Hi folks, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support us and you enjoy the work we do and you want to help us keep the lights on, because of course we're demonetized on YouTube, go over to lotuseats.com, sign up for only £5 a month, and go and watch some of the amazing premium content there, such as Connor Tomlinson's interviews with fascinating people. He has previously interviewed ex-Prime Minister Liz Truss, but recently he has interviewed Mary Harrington, a kind of dissident feminist who recognises, as we do, that we are being governed by a uniparty and the state of affairs needs to change. Also, while you're at it, go and follow us on Twitter at lotuseaters_com, and we will see you soon.